Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Professor Robin Landa as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Professor Robin is a distinguished professor and globally recognized authority in creativity, advertising, and branding. She currently serves as Michael Graves College within the Robert Busch School of Design at Kean University. Named by the Carnegie Foundation among the great teachers of our time, she received the 2024 Gold Design Education Recognition Award for her impact on creative education. The best-selling author of 27 books, her recent works include Shareworthy, published by Columbia University Press, and Branding as a Cultural Force. Her insights have been featured on Good Morning America, Newsweek, and in the New York Times, and she frequently writes for Inc., HBR, and Fast Company. A respected educator, judge, and mentor, Professor Robin continues to shape the future of design and inspire generations of creative professionals worldwide. In today's conversation, Professor Robin Landa explores the central ideas from her book, Branding as a Cultural Force, Purpose, Responsibility, and Resonance. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robin Landa to the conversation. Thank you,
Thank you
Professor
so
Robin.
much.
Yeah. Thank
Thank
you,
you so
Professor
much.
Robin, for graciously accepting our invitation. We are truly honored by your presence and sincerely grateful for the time you are sharing with us today.
Thank you, Deepak. I'm honored. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor, in the book, you argue that powerful brands shape culture rather than just reflect it. What's one example from the book that illustrates this shift?
I can actually give you two, if you don't mind. I think that your listeners will be familiar with both. Dove is one clear example. They didn't mirror prevailing beauty standards, but instead directly challenged a multi-million-dollar industry built on insecurity. And by featuring real women instead of idealized airbrushed models, the brand reframed who gets to be seen and who gets to be valued. They weren't just selling soap, but they helped normalize broader definitions of beauty and self-worth. And that's not culture following, but culture shaping. And I think a brand closer to home, to India, would be Ariel, and probably you can speak to it better than I can. But their Share the Load campaign really reflected household norms and challenged household norms about the responsibility of sharing household chores, domestic labor. One film that I write about in the book shows a father realizing that he had never helped with the laundry and how that shaped his daughter's expectations. And it made inequity visible when it was somewhat invisible. And they weren't positioning the detergent as a product benefit, but really advocating for gender equity in household chores. And the campaign sparked conversations, and I think it led to measurable shifts in attitudes and probably behavior.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Professor, how can brands tell when to authentically engage with a cultural moment versus staying silent and avoiding trend chasing?
Well, I think brands earn the right to speak on cultural issues when they make a long-term investment in an issue. It's not just verbiage, it's investing in communities, it's giving back, it's investing in programs and partnerships, resources, internal policy changes. So then you're not really trend chasing, you're culture changing. I think a brand has to ask certain questions like, have we been funding this issue? Do we have partnerships in the community or with government or with nonprofit organizations? So have we been doing it for a campaign cycle or for years? And have we changed our own practices? You know, you think about a brand like Patagonia that actually changed their hiring, their supply chain, their governance. It wasn't just messaging, it was literal changes in their foundation.
Professor, how are brands' promises evolving from product benefits to ethical and social commitments, as seen in examples like Shiba or Corona?
Well, for decades, brand promises were functional or emotional benefits. Now, I think the most powerful brands are making value-based promises, commitments about their role in the world that transcends transactions. Consumers, especially younger generations like Gen Z and Gen A, they don't separate commerce from behavior, from ethics. They ask questions like, what does this brand stand for? What kind of future are they building for us? What are they doing to the planet? And the product promise is really kind of a baseline. And the greater brand promise is about shared values and the tangible impact that a brand or a company can make. Sheba is one of my favorite examples because their Hope Grows campaign, they're not just promising better cat food, but they're promising to restore coral reefs. And you'd think that's kind of strange, but they're committed to generating over 1 million square meters of reef because healthy oceans sustain the fish that sustain the cats. So it's kind of a no-brainer, but it's a brilliant brand promise that adds to ecological restoration. Um, that's a profound shift from touting a product benefit to planetary stewardship. Or Corona, their commitment is to protecting beaches and oceans, places where their customers enjoy a refreshing cold beer. They're promising to combat plastic pollution in the places where their product is consumed. It's a brand promise really rooted in responsibility and reciprocity with the environment. I think what makes the promise is credible is the measurement. Sheba reports in their reports online about their reef restoration metrics. Corona tracks the plastic removal tonnage. So these commitments are differentiating their brands.
Professor, what do you mean by emotional architecture? And how can brands design experiences that build true communities, not just customers?
Well, emotional architecture is the intentional design of physical and digital brand experiences, campaigns, and actual spaces that create human connections and a sense of belonging, a sense of community. It's really not just about optimizing a customer's journey, but about designing the conditions to build a community. You want brand followers, brand sirens, brand mavens. Most brands think in linear terms, awareness, consideration, purchase. But emotional architecture, you have to think in an ecosystem. What are the ongoing environments that people feel where they feel understood, where they feel valued, where they can connect to one another, like creating a community? And in that model, the brand isn't the hero, the brand is the facilitator. So if you think of a brand like Apple, they don't just sell devices, they sell identity, right? They sell a community. You belong to a culture that's associated with creativity and thoughtful design. And then they reinforce that through their in-store experiences. They have amazing, I don't know if they have them in India, but here they have these beautiful in-store design, their product launches, and they have programs where you can go into the Apple Store and learn how to use the different Apple devices, workshops and programs. So they invite participation, but they provide the infrastructure. And that generates meeting. You can't buy that kind of community. You have to earn it.
Professor, from your interviews with leading creatives, what was one insight that most changed or deepened your view of branding as a cultural force?
I'll tell you honestly, there were so many fantastic interviews, so many great insights. But two that kind of stand out would be one from Dr. Leslie Ann Knoll, who is the Dean of Design at OCAD, in Canada. And she said that designers need to intentionally look for unintended consequences before, during, and after the creative process. And that kind of reframes everything because we rarely ask about what else happens. We like who is excluded, what power behavior change is there, what's being reinforced, what harm might follow. And that insight kind of shifts all the thinking to the process, to making sure that you're embedding awareness in the process. Another insight came from, my French is terrible, so forgive me, Gaëtan de Pelou, who is the chief creative officer of Marcel ad agency in Paris. And he articulated branding as a social contract. He argued that companies don't just have the rights to operate and profit, they have a responsibility to contribute positively to society. It kind of reminded me of a modern idea of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's civic responsibility. And together, these perspectives enhanced my own lens. Dr. Knoll asks, what are we not seeing? And De Pelou asks, what do we owe? What do we owe back to people? And I think that combination turns branding from commerce to culture.
Professor, in a time of purpose washing, how can brands avoid performative activism and demonstrate genuine long-term commitment to a cause?
Uh, well, when you look at brands like Dove and Nike, you see a few patterns emerge. I think if you start with looking for harmful norms rather than opportunities, so if going back to what I said about Dove, that they named a harm of unrealistic beauty standards. Nike acknowledged racial injustice, and they acknowledged the voices and the actions of prominent athletes. So a kind of moral clarity comes first, I think. And then when brands commit over time, so for example, the Dove's Real Beauty is over 20 years old. That's a long-term commitment to funding educational opportunities for girls, creating campaigns, creating workshops, going into communities, really looking at society and reflecting it back. They invest, in other words, they invest beyond messaging, and they're also not thinking of themselves as heroes, but as making the people who they feature the heroes. So if you think about the very famous Colin Kaepernick campaign for Nike, Dream Crazy, he was the hero. And they knew there would be pushback. They knew they would get people burning their Nikes, but they forged ahead because they believed in what he believed in.
Professor, what turns a brand story from simply memorable into truly share-worthy and capable of sparking a moment?
I think all great advertising, all great branding, and especially share-worthy ones start with a human insight, with an insight into your audience. I mean, some people say that it's an insight into the brand, but it would be great if there's an insight into the audience and the brand. I think cultural cachet only happens when you really, really understand your audience and the people you're speaking to. The most powerful brands are based on what all of us in the industry call a human truth. pointing to something that an insight, something that the audience cares about, a pain point, something that they struggle with, something they aspire to, um, experiences that are there but are rarely cited. And that's when the insight makes the difference between relevance and noise. You're not just speaking at people, but you're speaking to their desires, their needs, their aspirations. When a brand understands its audience deeply, it can create work that's interesting, because it reveals something new, something emerging, or something useful. It can help them with something, or identity affirming. They can relate to it. I interviewed Nick Law, who is the creative chairman of Accenture Song and one of the great minds in the industry. And he said that people want something either interesting or useful. And that kind of sums up what people are looking for. And people will share those things. But a great example is going back to Marcel ad agency in Paris, the work they did for Orange, which is a huge telecom. They realized that, sorry, I have a cold. People weren't watching women's soccer. They were watching men's soccer, but not women's soccer or football. What do you call it in India? Is it called soccer or football? Football?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Football. Yes,
I guess for most of the world, it's called football.
yes.
In the US, we call it soccer. So they created this amazing piece where it was a compilation of football highlights, which a lot of people share online. And you're watching these highlights of the men's team, Le Bleu, and then halfway through, they show you that you've really been watching the women's team. So they're not telling you that women's soccer is interesting. They're proving to you that it's just as exciting and technically amazing as the men's soccer. And that was shared widely. I mean, that went what we call viral. Everybody shared it because it was surprising, it was relatable, and it had resonance. So I think what makes something share-worthy isn't just the novelty, though. It's that it resonates culturally and it challenges people's assumptions. People are surprised. And it was genuinely interesting.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. How do you encourage your students and young professionals to see branding as a tool for systemic change, not just commercial success?
Um, I think what the main point that I try to convey is that brands already have money. They have a lot of money. They're controlling money and they're controlling our attention. They're influencing us. So the real question is, how should they use their money? And how should they use it in a way that isn't purely promotional? So if a brand is spending money to get our attention, that investment can do something useful. It can do something useful or positive for communities, education, society, the environment. So that kind of shifts the creative question from how do we say it louder and jazzier to what can we build or support with this same budget. And I also push my students to decolonize when they think about branding and to think about planet first in design. A lot of people talk about human-centered design, and I talk about planet first thinking, because no planet, no people. And I try to convey the idea that branding isn't culturally neutral. They need to understand their values, their voices are amplifying messages, how their work affects people, how it affects the planet. And that really requires deep audience insight. Young professionals have the chance to architect what comes next. And branding is a tool for transformation, but only if we train practitioners to understand its power and wield it with wisdom.
Professor Robin Landa, thank you for sharing such deep and generous insights on how brands can move beyond persuasion to become genuine force for cultural change. Your perspectives on purpose, responsibility, and resonance offer a powerful roadmap for creatives, marketers, and leaders. We want to build brands that stand for more than profit and truly contribute to society. It has been an absolute privilege to learn from your experience, thinking, and your book. And I'm sure our listeners will walk away inspired to rethink how they create, communicate, and lead in their own practice. Thank you once again.
Thank you. I'm honored.